I'm Claire, and I am 30 years old. I've been married for 2 years now, juggling my duties as a working housewife. I met my husband, Scott, at work, and now we live a happy life together. I wish I could say everything is perfect, but currently, I'm troubled by financial issues. Recently, my in-laws moved into a new house, but my brother-in-law, Eric, made an impossible promise for it, saying he would buy them the house. Eric's income is low. He quits jobs soon after starting and constantly changes them. Now, he's working at a company where he's overworked and underpaid. However, he's never been in debt before, so he managed to get approved for a 35-year mortgage. He then got carried away and bought my in-laws a new car, taking out a 10-year loan for it. Eric came begging to Scott, kneeling and saying, "I won't cause any more trouble." He asked Scott, "Can you help a little? Just $200 a month is enough." Scott is kind and easily persuaded. Even though $200 may seem manageable with your income, it's still not a small amount. Besides, we were against Eric taking out a loan in the first place. I tried to persuade him, but Scott said, "I owe my brother. Helping him out a bit is fine. I'll pay with my money, so don't worry." Scott told me that when he was a child, he got lost in the mountains and Eric found and saved him. Since then, Eric often uses his position as a lifesaver to make various demands on Scott. After Scott agreed to help with the loan payments, Eric's demands escalated. The agreement to pay only $200 a month soon increased by $100 each month, and we ended up covering 90% of the payments. Scott's monthly allowance couldn't cover it, so I had to contribute while saving money. I don't waste money, so I could afford to pay this amount. But honestly, I don't want to spend unnecessarily, especially since I want to have children in the future. Hey, wasn't the deal just $200? I can't understand how it came to this. It's okay now because I'm working, but what if I can't work anymore after having kids? We won't be able to pay then. That's true. Okay, I'll tell my brother that we can't pay after we have a child. Promise me. I can't forgive this even now. Scott called Eric to arrange that the payment would stop once we had a child. After that, I started trying to conceive. I didn't want to pay for Eric anymore. And then I got pregnant. Finally, I'm free from helping with Eric's repayments. I felt relieved. I didn't want to get pregnant in this situation, but it was the only way to change things. Then Scott made a suggestion. "Claire, I've been thinking. Maybe you'll agree with this idea. What's going on? Can you tell me more about it?" Actually, Scott's suggestion was a great idea. I was initially anxious, but I agreed to his proposal, thinking that if any problems arose, my child and I could escape. When I was 5 months pregnant, we didn't renew our apartment lease and decided to live with my in-laws. My in-laws were delighted, and I commuted from their house until I finally went on maternity leave. It's good to be dedicated to work, but don't push yourself too hard for the sake of the child. I couldn't fully accept my mother-in-law's concern. We're paying part of the mortgage, so it'll be tough without income. My mother-in-law smiled at my response. To be honest, I thought it was unfair to ask Eric to pay the mortgage. It's reassuring to know you two are helping. Her words made me slightly suspicious. It seemed like she didn't want Eric to pay, but it was fine if we did. I tried to forget her words, thinking it might be a misunderstanding. After that, I built a good relationship with my mother-in-law. There were no typical mother-in-law issues, and my father-in-law was a gentle person. I was initially worried, but then I was glad we lived together. I had no idea then that I would see an unpleasant side of my in-laws. Eventually, I gave birth. I planned to take a year off for childcare, thinking that I wouldn't have to pay 90% of the mortgage anymore lightened my spirits. But Scott showed me a message with a worried look. It was a one-sided message from Eric. "Sorry, I couldn't stick to the job again. I'm working part-time at an inn in the countryside. I'll pay 20% of the mortgage as usual, so please transfer the rest to my account as before. Please." Scott sent several messages, but Eric ignored them and didn't even read them. When Scott tried calling, Eric had blocked his number. "What are we going to do? We need to raise our daughter, right? Let's ask your parents to pay part of the mortgage. We can't afford it with just your salary. You're right. I'll talk to them. You have to. It doesn't matter if we owe them. We need to find Eric and make him pay. As I expressed my anger, Scott went to his parents' room with a wry smile. But it didn't go well. When Scott suggested that they help with the mortgage, his parents got angry and came to me. Scott stood behind them, looking awkward. You said you wanted to support Eric and agreed to pay part of the mortgage. Keep your promise. I retorted angrily to my father-in-law's words. Just to let you know, we never wanted to make these loan payments in the first place. It was Eric who forced this situation on us. It's because he irresponsibly took out a loan that we've had to rely on Scott. At these words, my mother-in-law began to defend Eric. How can you be so cold-hearted? They're brothers, after all. Shouldn't it be fine if they share the financial burden? Can't you be a little more filial? It was you who made Scott ask us for money, wasn't it? Kind-hearted Scott would never say such a thing. It's true that I said I didn't want to make any more payments. But Eric initially said that contributing $200 would be enough, and that was only supposed to be until our child was born. But that agreement was broken, so shouldn't you help out? We never said we wouldn't pay anything. Well, how cheeky. I don't mind being cheeky. If Scott and Eric were sharing the burden equally, I could understand. But we are paying 90% of it. It's us who are suffering because Eric suddenly said he would handle the loan. Even after I said all this, my in-laws didn't seem to understand. Don't be so arrogant over such a small amount of money. As a daughter-in-law, you should just obediently follow what Scott and we say. At that moment, Scott, who was always gentle and calm, changed his expression. I felt a chill down my spine. The saying, the gentler the person, the scarier they are when angry, came to mind. Scott, still smiling, began to speak. All right, I understand. Then we will leave this house. The reason we moved in was that I was worried about leaving Claire alone after she gave birth. Claire's parents had always said we could live with them, so we'll move out once we're ready. I nodded vigorously at Scott's words, feeling relieved. Actually, that had been our intention from the beginning. If we were going to pay the loan, we agreed to live with Scott's family under certain conditions. I didn't want to live with my in-laws, but I agreed to do so under the conditions Scott set. The condition was that if the in-laws sided with Eric, we would immediately leave their house and stop paying the loan. We had already contacted my parents, and they said we could come to them any time if anything happened. The in-laws, still not understanding, said confidently, "Do as you like." 3 days later, we packed our belongings and headed to my parents' house. Actually, both our workplaces were closer to my parents' house, so it was more convenient. When we arrived, my parents warmly welcomed us, and my favorite dishes were prepared. My daughter also received a lot of love, and although Scott was initially nervous and careful, he began to bond with my father, drinking and laughing together every night. About a month later, my in-laws and Eric stormed into my parents' house. Apparently, Eric had gone back to his parents' house, complaining about Scott not transferring the money. And then the three of them came to demand payment for the loan. We dealt with them without letting them inside. Why didn't you transfer the money? They said they couldn't make the withdrawal. If there's a shortfall, you should pay it yourself. Is that how you treat your benefactor? So arrogant. Benefactor, huh? How long do I have to be grateful? If anything, I feel like I've helped my brother out more times than I can count. What did you say? You're alive today thanks to me. Have you forgotten that day? Eric raised his voice in anger, trying to overpower Scott. Perhaps he thought that gentle Scott would comply if he yelled. I couldn't stand it anymore, and before Scott could say anything, I shouted back at Eric. Enough is enough. Can you stop threatening us with the past? We've repaid our debt to you. More importantly, why did you sign up for the house and car loans for your parents all by yourself? It was to repay my parents for all they've done. That's a lie. There were other ways, like a parent-child relay loan. I know you told Scott that your annual income isn't even $30,000 and you weren't sure if you'd pass the loan review. My words left my in-laws with shocked expressions. Eric, what do you mean your income isn't $30,000? Was it a lie when you said you had changed jobs and were earning over $80,000 and we could rest easy? Hey, Eric, answer properly. As my mother-in-law pressed him, Eric paled and started sweating. That's not true. Where did you hear such a thing? Maybe Scott. Did you use the speakerphone? Maybe it was a misunderstanding. He tried to escape with an explanation, but it was too late. Scott played a voice recording from his smartphone of his conversation with Eric. I exaggerated about earning $80,000 when I didn't even make $30,000. I was hoping the loan review wouldn't go through, but it did. I can afford the loan payments. Can you help me? You owe me for saving your life, right? Scott stopped the recording and looked coldly at Eric. Gone was the usual gentle Scott. I'm the type who's curious about things. I record all my calls. Claire knew because she heard this recording, not because I used a speaker. It's thanks to me that you're here today. So, help me with what I want to do. Don't you want to be filial to your parents? I took out the loan intending to be. Maybe you helped him as a child, but we've repaid that debt. Please don't ask for more. We have a daughter now and need money for her future. You just want to look good in front of your parents, right? Then do it on your own. I said that as I was unable to contain my anger. Scott quietly patted my shoulder. Thanks, Claire. That's enough. Scott, since we were kids, our parents always favored Eric. I was always second. Eric probably took out the loan not really to be filial, but to curry favor with them. And he took out the loan knowing he couldn't pay it, planning to make us pay 90% of it. There's no reasoning with such people. So, we're cutting ties. Scott glared at his parents and Eric. Seeing this, my in-laws started to make a fuss. How dare you talk about cutting ties? You owe us. You should be filial to Eric and us. We raised you. That's right. Do you know how much money we spent so you could go to college? Pay the loan expenses as a way to repay us. Each time my in-laws said something, I grew more and more disgusted. If you keep causing a scene, I'll call the police. Please don't contact us anymore. With that, I forced all three outside and slammed the door shut. Soon after, the police arrived, and my in-laws and Eric left quietly. It seemed my parents had called 911 over 10 minutes ago, sensing the argument wouldn't end. Afterwards, we explained the situation to the police and sent them home. It seems that the police can't intervene much in family matters. We talked with my parents and decided to move out immediately. We found a new place easier than expected and started living in a new apartment with our daughter 2 weeks later. We told my parents our address and promised to visit occasionally, but we didn't tell Scott's parents or Eric anything. Scott changed his phone number and took steps to ensure that his parents and Eric couldn't contact him. Later, Eric apparently struggled with the loan payments and, along with his parents, managed to make the monthly repayments. Scott's father had already retired, and his mother had long been a housewife, enjoying a pensioner's life. However, due to the loan repayments, both had to start part-time jobs, leading to a tough life given their declining health. Eric returned to his parents' house and found a new job. He earned a minimal income, which angered his parents. A friend living near Scott's family told us that they're barely getting by, looking constantly downhearted. We are enjoying a comfortable life in our new apartment, just the three of us. Scott recently got a promotion, resulting in a slight salary increase. Sometimes, I thought you might always be under Eric's thumb. Remembering Eric suddenly, I asked Scott about it. For me, he was still an important family member. Even though he's like that, the treatment from our parents was unfair, but I valued them all because they were family. But I snapped when my father called the loan repayment a trifle. That's when I clearly realized that my real family is not them but you and our daughter. Haha, that's kind of nice to hear. Scott, you look so scary then. I was shocked. Just thinking about what they were saying to my precious family, I couldn't control my anger. Scott and I smiled at each other. While we were talking, our daughter started crying. Oh, what's wrong? I got up, picked her up, and left the bedroom. Scott has work tomorrow, so he needs to rest. I decided to focus on taking care of our daughter instead. I reaffirmed my desire to protect my precious family. When I asked, "Did you build this mansion, Laura?" my sister-in-law replied with a proud face, "Yes, it's a bit too big for living alone, but it's a spacious 3-room house designed for 2 generations. Maybe I should invite my boyfriend to stay on the first floor." I secretly smiled to myself at her words. She was probably lost in some distant dream. What's with that sudden laugh? It's creepy. My sister-in-law looked at me intently, puzzled by my smile. Her eyes held me as if seeing something unknown. Without breaking a smile, I shared a fact with my sister-in-law. My name is Victoria. I am an office worker nearing the milestone of my 40s. I married Edward, my boss in the same sales department, at the age of 30. Having lost my parents as a child and raised while moving between relatives' houses, I have no place to call my hometown. I revealed this fact to my husband early on, and he did not mind it and did not change in the way he treated me. My parents-in-law have always been warm ever since we were dating, often inviting me over for meals at their home. After marriage, my parents-in-law loved me like their own child, and it was natural for me to live in my husband's family home. "This is your new home," my mother-in-law declared, and I still remember my husband's warm smile and my father-in-law's bright expression. My newlywed life was ideal, except for one point. There was one person who disapproved of our marriage and me living with them, my sister-in-law, Laura. She is 3 years older than my husband, lives in the house, but leads an active nightlife and rarely meets us in our daily life. However, her room is often littered with luxury brand bags, and her belongings are carelessly scattered in the living room. Judging from her possessions, it can be inferred that she has quite a lot of money, but no one in the family knows her exact occupation. My parents-in-law tend to avoid the topic of my sister-in-law, and any questions are met with vague answers. My husband seems indifferent to her presence. Honestly, I don't get along with my sister-in-law. Whenever I saw her in the living room on my days off, my body stiffened and I froze. Oh gosh, a child from a Pua family is in the living room. I might catch bad luck and end up in poverty by being so close, she said, and I looked down while holding a bitten toast, unable to muster the courage to leave. My mother-in-law, who was next to me, admonished her, but it didn't seem to reach her. Laura simply brushed her flowing hair, looked down at me, and said, "You are a stranger to me. It would be troubling if you stay here forever." Her words pierced my heart. I apologized in a small voice, and she snorted and left the room. "Don't worry about it," my mother-in-law consoled me, but the fog in my heart didn't clear up. As my sister-in-law said, I'm not originally a member of this family. Even if it's the family I married into, I'm still an outsider. "If only you were our child instead of Laura," my mother-in-law joked. It seemed that my parents-in-law and husband wished inside their hearts that my sister-in-law would leave the house, but there was no sign of that happening. I was unsure whether to tell my mother-in-law about a scene I witnessed recently. In the end, I decided to keep it to myself, fearing retaliation from my sister-in-law. I managed to force a smile in front of my mother-in-law while finishing a tasteless breakfast. Then came a long stretch of rainy days in the area we lived in. The old house seemed to be crying out in pain. There were leaks in the corridor previously, but never as badly as this time, and my mother-in-law could only smile wryly. The emergency repairs done by my father-in-law and husband were mostly ineffective, and the buckets placed around the house overflowed with rainwater, soaking the floors. Fortunately, our bedrooms and the living room were safe, and we could manage to live somehow. However, the problem was Laura's room. She hadn't been home for several days and would surely be surprised to see the state of her room. My mother-in-law and I had moved out her precious branded bags and watches from the room, but the room itself was as wet as if it had been exposed to the rain outside. It was impossible to even set foot in the room, let alone sleep in it. After moving everything out, we laid down blue tarps on the floor and stacks and bags at its entrance. We finished the work and sat down exhausted on the living room sofa. "Laura might have to spend some time in the living room for now," said my mother-in-law with a wary voice. As I nodded unconsciously, I noticed the door being opened forcefully. Turning around, there was Laura standing at the entrance, looking at us with an angry expression. Apparently having seen the disastrous state her room was in, with her hair and coat wet. "My room is unusable," she said in a low voice, barely containing her anger. My mother-in-law hesitated for a moment but then looked at her intently, regaining her composure. "You can't live in that room until the repairs are done, can you? So, use the living room on the first floor, or maybe this is an opportunity for you to become independent." "What? Why should I have to leave?" "The one who should leave is that poor person," she shouted while pointing at me. Caught off guard by suddenly being the topic of conversation, all I could do was toastari back at her. "You'll have to lend me your room. Pack your things and leave quickly." But to move so suddenly. As I spoke, my sister-in-law glared at my mother-in-law. "That would be fine with you, right, Mom? How about we stop pretending to be family with someone who got married into this house?" For just a moment, I looked at my mother-in-law. Her face remained unflinching, hardened even under verbal assault, briefly revealing weariness and resignation. "If you insist so strongly, Laura, then you should cover the repair costs. You have a lot of money, don't you?" "We don't have enough savings to fix this house." My mother-in-law retorted unexpectedly, leaving my sister-in-law at a loss for words. My eyes naturally compared my mother-in-law's worn-out apron with Laura's branded, flashy dress. My parents-in-law were already retired and living on a pension, while it was clear that my sister-in-law, despite her unclear job, had considerable income. The cost of repairing the family home should not be an issue for her. She had never lived independently, always staying at her parents' house, and now she was trying to push me out. Surely she should be the one to take care of the repairs. However, my sister-in-law firmly shook her head. "I won't spend my money on such an old house. I absolutely don't want to do that." She said this with indifference, not giving any attention to us, and began to focus on her smartphone screen. While I was unsure about my next move, I stealthily observed my mother-in-law's expression. Would the difficulty be resolved immediately if I left the house? In the silence, it seemed like my mother-in-law and I were searching for what to say next. Then Laura, who had taken her eyes off her smartphone, looked at me, obviously displeased. "Why are you still here? Get out quickly." I can't move my things in. It seemed impossible to convince my sister-in-law no matter the argument. When my mother-in-law looked at me, she murmured apologetically, "I'm sorry." Hearing those words, I nodded in acceptance. I had brought only a few belongings to my parents-in-law's house. I packed my minimal, essential clothing into a suitcase, crammed my daily necessities into a bag, and returned to the living room just as my husband came home and confronted my mother-in-law. After speaking to my husband and exchanging a few words, I left the house, leaving behind my mother-in-law's faint voice saying, "Sorry, both of you." My parents-in-law seemed unable to speak against my sister-in-law for some reason. As my husband muttered something while pulling the suitcase, I asked him a question, and he quietly answered, "Laura's actually the child of Dad's previous wife, and Dad feels guilty for separating her from her mother. Mom can't say anything because Laura is her stepdaughter. Nevertheless, it seems both of them are overly fearful of her." My husband's murmurings dissolved into the slowly darkening sky. I felt a snag in my heart, yet I could find no words to reply. Now, more than ever, I must consider our own living situation rather than that of my in-laws. We need to visit a real estate agent soon to find a new place to live. Desperately suppressing my sinking heart, I started discussing dinner plans with my husband in a bright tone. After spending a few days in a hotel following our departure from my in-laws' house, we were fortunate to find an apartment conveniently located between our workplaces and not far from my in-laws' house, allowing us to start a new life without the need for a major move. Half a year had passed since we left my in-laws' house. As planned, we left the apartment on our day off and headed to a specific location. In just a short 15-minute walk, a gleaming new house came into view. A few cars were neatly parked in the spacious driveway, and it seemed a barbecue was being held in the garden, which was partially visible from the street. Stepping onto the property unexpectedly, I spotted the person of interest at the center of the laughter and conversation. She noticed me and looked surprised. "Oh, it's you, Victoria," my sister-in-law said as she informed her friends of something, and then made her way through the crowd toward me. She was still dressed in flashy jewelry and an expensive dress, exuding the air of affluence. Standing before me, her demeanor shifted from the bright expression she had given her friends to a cold gaze as she looked down at me. "I don't remember inviting any poor people." "What? Did you come to search the garbage?" "No, I didn't come here with that intention." "Humph, it seems you can't become a proper adult without parents." I didn't respond to my sister-in-law but looked around instead, noticing her friends and acquaintances gathered in her new home, celebrating the housewarming. Although I hadn't received a formal invitation, my husband had learned about the party through her social media account and had informed me. After surveying the surroundings with a calm demeanor, I looked back at my sister-in-law. "Did you build this mansion, Laura?" I asked, to which she proudly replied, "Yes, it's a bit too big for just myself, but it's a spacious 3-room house for 2 generations. Maybe I should invite my boyfriend to live on the first floor." I secretly smiled to myself at her words. She was probably indulging in some distant dream. "What's wrong?" "Don't start laughing suddenly. It's creepy." My sister-in-law stared at me, puzzled by my smile. Her eyes held me as if looking at something unknown. Without breaking a smile, I revealed a fact to her. "Actually, this house is mine." My sister-in-law stopped in her tracks. "You must be mistaken," she said, tilting her head. I confidently reiterated that the house was indeed mine. Her complexion changed abruptly, turning red. "What nonsense are you talking about? Stop joking." As expected, my sister-in-law attempted to argue back forcefully. Her loud voice caused some of the surrounding people to turn and look our way. My sister-in-law watched my next move with a somewhat embarrassed shrug of her shoulders. I took a document from my bag and presented it in front of her. "Is this a deed?" My sister-in-law stared at the document I presented. I pointed to a specific line in the document, and her gaze followed. At that moment, her facial expression twisted. My name was clearly written on that deed. The new house that my sister-in-law believed was hers was actually mine. After my parents passed away, I had saved almost all of the insurance money and inheritance I received. I had dreamed of building my own house since adulthood. Seeing the deterioration of my parents-in-law's house and their hardships, I decided that it was time to use that money. And I was determined that this house must not be taken by my sister-in-law. In fact, I financed and built this residence. However, you have been claiming it as your own without permission and even hosted a party here. Before I knew it, a crowd of curious onlookers had gathered around us, quietly watching the unfolding situation. The tension gradually escalated as people began to ask, "Isn't this house yours?" "Yes, it's my house." After all, the deed and the keys were in the house, my sister-in-law asserted strongly. "That was meant to be given to your parents since we were planning to live together. Did you take the keys without permission?" As I continued speaking, I regretted my carelessness for not having given the keys to my parents-in-law beforehand. I wondered why my sister-in-law did not realize that I was the one who had built the house, even though she must have seen the deed. Perhaps she had been indulging in the ideal fantasy of living there only with her parents. "Have you been receiving money and valuables from your parents in this way until now?" I asked sharply. My sister-in-law lost her words for a moment, looking stunned, but soon countered with an angry voice. "Stop making such empty excuses. My parents were supporting me so that I wouldn't have to work. Isn't that what parents are supposed to do?" I retorted with equal force. "For your lavish lifestyle, the two of them cut back on food expenses and saved money. How do you think your friends would feel if they knew you were living the high life by depleting the savings of your parents, who are working hard and saving to the extreme?" The crowd murmured, and the atmosphere changed completely. The relationships my sister-in-law had built on the foundation of money seemed to crumble audibly. According to my husband, who had shown me her social media, she claimed to be an investment expert and proudly displayed expensive cars, bags, and watches worth a month of my salary. Her circle consisted of celebrities and those pretending to be one. If it was revealed that her luxurious lifestyle was built on the extreme saving and precarious living of her parents. No, everyone. Everything this person is saying is a lie. My sister-in-law tried desperately to explain to the onlookers, but skeptical gazes gradually cornered her. There was no longer anyone who admired her. They left the garden one by one, heading back to their respective homes. Soon, only Laura and I were left in the vast garden. The savory smell of the barbecue melted into the silent air. She collapsed onto the ground, powerless. Then, hearing modest footsteps, I turned to see my parents-in-law standing with stern expressions. They glanced at the bright new house for a moment before looking down at my sister-in-law sitting on the ground. "We have spoiled you too much until now. From now on, you must stand on your own 2 feet and live on your own," said my father-in-law with weighty words. My sister-in-law seemed to look at them with tears, begging for help. "Aren't you two going to live in this house? Then give me the old house. What am I supposed to do if I don't have a place to live?" Her desperate cry was drowned out by the sound of footsteps on the lawn, and then my husband appeared. As if seeing through my sister-in-law's heart, he stated matter-of-factly, "The house you grew up in has already been demolished, so there is no place for you to return. Apologize to Victoria and live here, or else you'll have to live independently." How can this be? In the end, my sister-in-law remained crouching in the garden, beginning to cry. However, her pride was too high to apologize to me. As expected, she continued to blame me but never asked to stay in the house. With no more assistance from her parents and being evicted from the demolished family home, she seemed lost. The only way for her to live independently was to work. But finding a job was difficult for her, who had never worked properly before. And according to my husband, she barely managed to get by with a live-in job at a hotel she had found. Later, she was seen visiting my parents-in-law and husband, begging for financial help. But my husband stated, "If you come here again, I will call the police." Her failure to apologize to me and ask for help might be seen as a sign of excessive pride. On the other hand, my parents-in-law offered to share the construction costs of the new house, but I declined. The house was built with the intention for us as a couple to live in. Their sentiment alone was enough for me. Still, my parents-in-law were adamant about offering financial support. After much deliberation, instead of accepting the money, I asked them to take care of our future child. At that time, I had just learned that I was pregnant. My parents-in-law were overjoyed at the news and wholeheartedly welcomed the addition to the family. My husband, knowing that our child's birth was imminent, became even more devoted to his work. This new house will proudly fulfill its duty as the final residence for my parents-in-law and as the place I can always return